An abandoned bank, a locked vault, 6 plastic barrels hidden inside. When police finally open them, they uncover a nightmare that had been building for years. Bodies had been hidden, moved, and kept secret while the people responsible continued living among their neighbors in South Australia. But the barrels were only part of the story. Behind them was a web of manipulation, false identities, stolen money, and a group drawn deeper into murder by one controlling figure. What investigators uncovered in Snowtown would become one of the darkest criminal cases in Australian history, and leave an entire country asking how something this horrific stayed hidden for so long.
In this small town, if you were on this man's list, you would never see what was coming.
And that's not a tagline, that's a fact. For 7 years in this quiet corner of South Australia, 12 people went missing. And there was always a story that somehow came from somebody close to them. She disappeared in the night. She ran off with her boyfriend. He locked himself in a bedroom and was never seen again.
Yeah, every story was a lie, and every liar was one of the victim's most trusted friends. Remember, everyone lies, but the evidence doesn't.
Exactly. And in May of 1999, police found in a rusted bank vault was something so disturbing that within 48 hours, it would be making news across the planet.
Yeah, it was 6 barrels. 8 bodies, chemically preserved so no one would ever come looking.
And the man who put him there, he wasn't hiding at all. He was holding court in his kitchen, beer in hand, trying to convince his neighbors that murder was a necessary community service.
Yeah, he talked a teenage boy into helping kill his own brothers.
He did. And even after the fact, he was cashing victims' welfare checks for years and years after they were dead, and nobody noticed because on paper, these people were very much still alive. And then somewhere in a police evidence locker, there are still tapes of these victims clinging on to their lives, saying their goodbyes.
Yeah, so today we're not just opening the vault. We're showing you exactly how 12 disappearances went unquestioned for the better part of a decade. And one mistake that brought the whole thing down. One of them is still fighting to get out of jail. Welcome to Unlawful Acts, the podcast where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, unearthing the shocking and often hidden stories behind the world's most infamous criminals. I'm your host, Susan Davis.
And I'm your co-host, Jocelyn Frank-Husen. And don't look away on this one, because what was hidden in the vault isn't even the worst part of the story. Truly, it's how long everybody believed the lie.
Okay, so rewind this a little bit with me, Jocelyn.
Yes.
Because it doesn't start in the vault. It actually starts somewhere far more ordinary. And that's exactly what makes it sort of unsettling.
Yes, absolutely. And let's set the scene. Snowtown is typically, I don't know, it's a footnote, right? It's a town of maybe 500 people. There's one pub, wheat fields as far as the eye can see. And it's the type of town where a car drives down the road that's out of the ordinary, and it goes noticed in a second. It's the type of place that everybody's in everybody's business. And let me tell you, this town had almost nothing to do with this story, despite the fact that what was found, these victims' remains were found in chemically filled barrels in a bank vault. Until it did.
Yeah, only one of the 12 victims was actually killed there. The town just happened to have an empty bank vault where they could hide the victims.
Yes, and the real hunting ground was Adelaide, northern suburbs. Salisbury North, Elizabeth, Murray Bridge. These are working class, struggling, tight knit communities. And like I said, typically the kind of place that everybody is in everybody's business because there's not really a lot going on or much more to do.
Yeah, and this mattered enormously because this is a story about a social circle that was so toxic it actually spiraled into something lethal. At the center of it was just one man, John Justin Bunting.
And let's sit with him for a minute because if it weren't for Bunting, none of this over the next 7 years would have ever happened.
Yeah, he worked odd jobs and he sort of cultivated this public persona as being, that public protector. He specifically would hunt down what he called pedophiles. He talked about it constantly. And from the outside, it just looked like a one-man moral crusade.
Well, and that's exactly the hook that let him get close enough to control these people. Because from the outside, he didn't look dangerous. He just looked like the guy that was brave enough to finally say what everybody was thinking out loud.
Yeah, he ran informal meetings, around the kitchen table, beers, cigarettes, spent hours deciding, who in the neighborhood was suspect and who might be a pedophile or a homosexual or someone who was drug addicted and wasting the state's money.
And once Bunting made that call about someone, that was essentially a death sentence. There's no trial. There's no appeal. This is just a decision that's made over a beer and a cigarette at somebody's kitchen table.
Yeah, and so his closest accomplice was a guy by the name of Robert Joe Wagner. And by most accounts, he was probably the most physically violent of the group. And he was essentially Bunting's enforcer.
And then there's a figure in this story who I think is just the most gutting. This is James Vlasakis. He's a teenager, and he's also the son of Bunting's girlfriend.
He's just a kid.
He's just a kid. And this young kid, God, it's horrible. He didn't choose this world. He was kind of dragged into it because he had no idea, but he was being raised by a predator. This is somebody who could actually specialize in turning his vulnerabilities into making him an accomplice for this whole thing. So by the early 1990s, all of the pieces here are in place. We have Bunting, who's the architect. We have Wagner, who's the enforcer. We have the young Vlasakis, who is the kid who's just being pulled in deeper and deeper as the years go by. And then later, somebody else enters the conversation. This is Mark Hayden. This man becomes central to hiding the bodies over the course of the 7 years that these murders went down. And actually, I hate to say, but his wife actually ended up being one of the victims.
Yeah, so that's the cast. So here's where the talk really turns into actual killings. So they started with this group, and then they began to sort of implement some of those plans that they had. The murders would actually stretch across 7 years. They started in August of 1992 and then went all the way through May of 1999. And it wasn't just one snap decision. It was a slow, sort of deliberate climb. And that's kind of what makes it so horrifying. They're going through this social circle of theirs and their extended social circle. And there was, during this whole period, time and time again, there was an opportunity to make it stop.
The first victim we want to take notice to is a gentleman by the name of Clinton Trezise. He was only 20 years old. And this is a friend that was inside Bunting's circle. He was the first person that was killed in 1992, and his body was buried just outside the city, and it was actually hidden for years until Bunting himself took police directly to the spot he was buried.
Yeah, and then from there was a man by the name of Ray Davies. He was 26 years old. He was intellectually sort of disabled. And he was living on the property of Bunting's on-again, off-again girlfriend, Susan Allen. He then he was kind of like that kid who was like everybody's neighbor, everybody's friend. He wasn't bothering anybody. And for a while, he was just nobody's priority.
And again, very young. I mean, this is somebody that was just 26. The first victim was 20 years old. And this was not random at all. None of it was. It was all very calculated. And Bunting started targeting people within the extensions of the social circle that he lived in. Let's say society had already kind of pushed them to the outskirts and the edges of that circle. He was targeting people whose disappearances might not set off alarms at all. Maybe nobody would notice for a few days, a few weeks, or even a few months. And what's really disturbing about that is that not only did he target people that were vulnerable, but all of those people were tortured before they were killed by him. Various methods of torture. They were beaten. He was known to use electric shocks, and in several cases, their fingers or toes were actually smashed, likely, God, I mean, just thinking about that, likely when they're trying to force financial information out of them, right? So he's taking a hammer to their fingers or their toes to somehow try to coerce that information out of them. He's trying to get PIN numbers or bank account information, passwords, and most of them were actually strangled to death after they were being tortured and pressed for this information, often with rope or by hand, and also sometimes while they were restrained, so they weren't even in a position where they could fight back. And some victims, on top of being tortured and beaten, they were stabbed in addition to being strangled, tortured, beaten, bound, and tied. And there was one person actually who was both stabbed and strangled during his killing. So it's like, enough is enough. This is somebody who is really, really angry and wanted to harm the victims in any way that they could.
Yeah, and not one of these people was really a stranger, and it kind of repeated itself because there was Gavin Porter. Now, he was schizophrenic in the neighborhood, and he was addicted to drugs. And then there was Gary O'Dwyer. He had been in a car accident and was permanently disabled from that and was living on his pension. And then his own neighbors that he had especially had a problem with, Michelle Gardner and Vanessa Lane. They were two transgender women who were living next door, but they were still inside that same extended social circle. So they all had different lives, but the same kind of vulnerability, and the same reason that Bunting, zeroed in and picked them.
And that's the point that I want to drive home, is that not one of these people was a stranger. They were all already inside that circle. They were selected for that reason. And every single one of them was a neighbor, a tenant, a friend, an extended family member. And that's what, made them easy targets. Nobody had to go looking for the victims because the victims were already in front of their face. And Bunting just had to look around the room and make his next pick.
Yeah, so we're going to be careful here.
Yes.
These are real people. Several victims, as you mentioned, they endured prolonged torture, psychological abuse,
Horrific.
Personal abuse, and before they killed them. So they spent a lot of time just torturing the heck out of these people. Now, Bunting, who's the ringleader, and his main guy, Wagner, they subjected multiple people to this sort of torture. And in one documented instance, what they did is they actually took this teenage victim, Frederick Brooks, and they actually took objects and inserted them into his genitalia. And then they actually hooked his genitalia up to electric shock generators and shocked him continuously for hours. And this is all while he's gagged and bound and completely helpless. In fact, in the trial, is sort of exposed a deeply twisted sort of irony, because Bunting himself and along with Valsakis, had been victims of severe childhood abuse.
Yes.
And so Bunting weaponized this shared trauma and manipulated Valsakis into joining the cause under sort of a false pretense of exacting sort of a vigilante kind of justice. He said that his crusade was against the pedophiles who had tormented them as children. So he's kind of got Valsakis sort of caught up in all of this. He pointed at homosexuals and transgenders. And in reality, they just used this narrative to inflict their own sadistic sort of sexualized violence on all these highly vulnerable individuals. The victims were tied up. They were interrogated, and again, they were coerced into handing over their bank information, their PIN numbers, all the information about Social Security numbers, all the information that they could get their hands on so they could not only, sort of grab all their financials, but they could also get into their pensions and their government checks. Now, I'm not going to walk through all of the graphic details. I think we've sort of done that already. But death just wouldn't come quickly enough for these poor people.
Truly.
Because they were tortured for hours and sometimes days. And it was that deliberate cruelty in the case that was pointed out again later as they went to trial in this case.
Because underneath that warped ideology was something else entirely. There's a running fraud that's happening here. As if torturing and killing these people isn't enough, they did so while they were trying to get somebody to give over their PIN number so that they could keep draining their pension or their welfare payments well after they were dead. Some victims actually were not reported missing for, God, years,
Right.
Because on paper, these people were very much alive. Their bills were still getting paid. The payments were still coming in and out of their account. There was a paper trail for what looked like somebody just out there living their life, normal behaviors. And that wasn't the case at all.
Yeah, this wasn't about murder. This was a kind of, and it wasn't about some messed up moral crusade. It was really theft disguised as murder. And Bunting and his crew, after they stole all of this information, what they then in addition to all of that, the Australian government has a policy of verifying, who these people are, sort of, proof of life sort of thing. So the killers made audio tapes and forced their victims to make these audio tapes that would provide that ongoing verification. And it would help them sustain the massive welfare fraud and keep police kind of at bay while they were doing all this. And then it also kind of tricked the victims' families into believing that these people had just suddenly left, the town, and they did it by choice. And so all of this was carefully designed really just to steal money. And, it's believed that the tapes themselves were actually found in Robert Wagner's house that he owned. The police actually did go and get a search warrant, and they searched the house that he used to own and found all of these tapes under a bed in that house.
I think the tapes are the worst part.
Yeah.
To me. It makes me sick. So I want to bring us to Susan Allen, who is the ex-girlfriend of Bunting and whose death perfectly illustrates the calculated pattern that was happening here. It's financial exploitation, there's manipulation by proximity, and what I can only say was an absolutely brutal way of disposing the bodies. So even though Ms. Allen's remains were dismembered and found buried in Bunting's former backyard, and this was on May 23rd of 1999, Bunting and Wagner actually maintained that she died of a natural heart attack, that she was just suffered a cardiac arrest and died. And because of a hung jury, Bunting was actually never convicted of her murder. Isn't that insane? She was never convicted.
Yeah, we just buried her in the backyard.
Yeah, she just up and died, and we buried her in the backyard. Totally normal. That was my girlfriend. Nothing to see here. Just hard to wrap my head around. So by concealing her death and hiding her dismembered body, which, mind you, she died of a heart attack. We
But they
chose
cut
to
her out.
dismember. Yes.
Sure.
Bunting pockets almost $17,000 of her government welfare checks amidst all of this. It's just depraved.
And Hayden's wife kind of suffered the same
Yes.
fate as well.
Yes.
So now we've got Bunting's girlfriend, Hayden's wife. I mean, I guess we should be grateful that Robert Wagner didn't have anyone special in his life.
Absolutely.
And then there's Valsakis. He was just a teenager. And so he's being pulled deeper and deeper into this and being groomed by Bunting to the point that he made him complicit in killing both his half-brother and his other brother. So his half-brother, Troy Yude, he helped Bunting kill them. And then they turned to the stepbrother, which I believe was Suzanne's son, David Johnson.
Troy Yude's death, this is one of the darkest threads in the case. I mean, these are all just young boys that are related to one another by relationship or by blood. And Vlasakis had actually confided in Bunting that Yude had abused him years earlier. So Bunting takes that confession, which is real trauma from a kid that is close to him, somebody that trusted him and looked up to him, and twists it into some sort of warped justification for Vlasakis to kill to kill Yude and get revenge.
Yeah. So fast forward 1998, 1999. The group had killed about 10 people at this point. The remains were dismembered and sealed into barrels, and they were treated with chemicals to sort of slow the decomposition of the bodies. And the barrels had been scattered around at first, and then they found this defunct bank in the middle of town with a vault. And Mark Hayden had actually had access to this building. So they agreed that this building was the perfect place to store these barrels. And because the heavy vault doors, when they close, they actually seal everything in there. They seal in all the decomposing smells of the bodies and what have you. And it really sort of, kept the town from having any kind of immediate alarm of what's going on over there. What are they using that bank for? So again, they chose this location because they could hide the bodies there and because of the vault.
Susan, I have to stop us right there because what's coming in the next few minutes is a part that I think will keep our observers up at night. I know that it's doing that for me. This one is one of the more disturbing of the stories that we get to tell here on our show. That being said, if you are new to our show, welcome. Please hit like, comment, subscribe. You don't want to miss what's coming up next, and we do this every week. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're listening from.
And so how does a group that killed for 7 years, just quietly keep cashing dead people's checks and emptying their bank accounts? How did they finally get caught?
Well, it actually starts unraveling with the last person that Bunting killed. This is David Johnson. He's 24 years old at the time of his death, and to remind our viewers, he's Bunting's own stepson. This is somebody that's extremely close to him. This is also Vlasakis' stepbrother, and over the course of the years that they were all one family, Bunting actually grew to just despise Johnson, and for no reason that this poor kid can control at all. He was just, a little too preppy, a little too clean cut. Maybe he thought he was a goody two-shoes, whatever the case may be. He called him a yuppie. I mean, come on, he's just a kid. He's 24 years old. And he decided that because of who David Johnson was, he just never quite fit in to the group, which is exactly what made him the perfect target.
Not that he'd done anything wrong.
No, he hadn't done anything wrong. Maybe he combed his hair a little bit too tight. That's what he was guilty of. So, May of 1999, Vlasakis actually was used to lure in his own stepbrother into the old bank building in Snowtown. This is where the vault exists, and it's under the guise of something is being offered for sale there. So the second Johnson actually steps inside, he's brutally attacked. Johnson becomes the only victim that was actually killed inside the town of Snowtown. So all other 11 victims were killed outside and then brought to the bank vault. His death was the one that finally puts the police onto the trail of this crew because unlike some of the earlier victims, people close to him started asking real questions about what was going on. They were curious about his whereabouts and they were asking them very loudly.
Yeah, around the same time, the South Australian police had already quietly opened an investigation into the disappearances that were happening around this social circle. Mm-hmm. Remember, Elizabeth Hayden, she disappeared in 1998. And so that really raised a lot of suspicion because her family and friends, they didn't believe that the stories that they were being told were very inconsistent. And they, it didn't make sense to them that she had just gone, left. So, inconsistent stories are sort of like that 5-alarm fire with investigators. Once police start pulling the threads, the bank withdrawals, the pension checks and all of that being redirected to these individuals, the bills being paid supposedly that these people are still alive somewhere doing all this. Mm-hmm. It just didn't add up after they started talking to witnesses. So the detectives noticed that several of these people actually knew each other. So they established that they were part of the social circle or that extended group that existed. And then they noticed that these people who were killed all had a situation or that they believe were killed at that time, all had the same thing. They had the unusual withdrawals from their accounts. They had the redirection of the money. And then as they started to go through this, they started to realize it all sort of pointed at one particular individual, and that was John Bunting. And then they sort of noticed that within that little inner circle, it included Robert Wagner and Mark Hayden. And they got a tip about the rented bank vault or the rented bank in the middle of town. So now on May 20th of 1999, they actually got a search warrant and they went into that old bank in that building in downtown Snowtown.
And that's when they first opened this vault. And what they discovered inside was 6 barrels containing the remains of 8 victims, preserved in a chemical compound that was there to slow the decomposition of these bodies. And officers that were on the scene that day would describe it as the most horrific crime scene that they had ever witnessed. Some of them to this day say that they could never fully shake it off. I mean, I just can't even imagine the sight, the smell, the sheer shock of walking into something like that, especially in a small town.
Sure.
This is a town where only 500 people live, so things like this don't really go on. Nothing really does. And, it gets worse. 2 bodies were later recovered. These people were buried in the backyard of a house that was connected to the group. And police went on to connect an additional 2 deaths from earlier years in the same circle, which is what brings our confirmed total to 12.
So they arrest the four men in this case. So we go back to our players. We've got Bunting, Wagner, Valsakis, and Hayden.
Yes.
And so what followed was really one of the most complicated trials that the Australian government had ever really encountered because of all this stuff going on. But the moment of what these men had done reached the public, man, it just went off like wildfire.
You would think that it would be more straightforward, right?
Yeah.
But it never is.
12 people dead.
12 people dead. There's multiple defendants here. There's years of damning evidence. And the process actually ran so long that South Australian courts actually imposed suppression orders on parts of the testimony. They did this to try to keep the sheer volume of disturbing detail concise and actually away from the jury to prevent them from being prejudiced about the information before the verdict comes in.
Yeah, it was pretty grotesque, the whole thing. And the person who cracked the case wide open really was the young man, James Valsakis.
Yes.
Because he was the center of their whole investigation.
Yes. And he was facing his own murder charges at the time, too. At this point, he makes a decision that is going to redefine the rest of the trial. He actually pleads guilty to 4 counts of murder and agrees to testify against Bunting, Wagner, and Hayden in exchange for a reduced sentence. The trial, this is where it really gets messed up. At the trial, they play the recordings. Remember the tapes? They would play the recordings of the torture sessions where the victims were forced to actually confess fabricated stories about their lives and what was going on with them into the recording devices as proof of life.
Can't imagine sitting there and listening to all that. That's just excruciating. Not only for the families, but the jurors now have to listen to this. They don't have any choice because they've got a big decision to make. You know, it's just unreal. But Valsakis, his personal testimony was where the full sort of methodical explanation of what the group did and how they did it sort of came out. I mean, this was not just a faceless tape on a tape recorder. This was actually somebody sitting in the stand face to face with those jurors and those families, explaining to them what had gone down. And this is where it sort of starts to hit at home. Not just, what happened to each victim, but the psychology behind it. And he described how Bunting could talk almost anyone into believing that murder was justice for something they had done. He described being manipulated as a teenager into becoming the murderer's accomplice. And then he described some of the more shocking details ever to surface in that Australian courtroom. Whew. I know. I mean, he just went into everything. And the jury I think everybody was not only sickened, but dumbfounded that this had been going on in this small town for so long.
It really is incomprehensible when you, like we are right now, sit here and reflect on everything that went down. It's just really hard to understand how somebody could even be capable of doing something like this. And when this was all going down, the people in the courtroom, there are hardened lawyers. There are people that are criminal defense attorneys that have been so for the entirety of their professional careers. These people have heard it all, right?
Well, they thought they had.
Good point. They thought they had.
Right.
They really thought they had, and I'm sure that the veteran journalists had felt the same way too.
Sure.
But that was not the case. There was an audible reaction from the people that were in the courtroom, and this is the detail that those people remember above everything else that was released as a part of the trial of this case.
Yeah, under oath, Valsakis, he testified that after David Johnson was killed, Wagner dismembered and mutilated part of his body. And it was kind of that as he described it, that final act of sort of degradation or humiliation against the person, the victim. The dismemberment really was, and mutilation was really like he took them and just stuffed them. People he knew, people who were part of his social circle, cut them up, stuck them in a barrel. And that's a detail that sort of made headlines around the world, and a huge part of why this case is remembered as sort of that uniquely shocking case, even when it's measured against some of the other cases that the Australians have faced.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And by September 2003, this is where we are, where the verdicts landed.
Right.
Bunting is convicted of 11 counts of murder. Wagner is convicted of 10. And both of these gentlemen receive consecutive life sentences without the possibility of ever being awarded parole, meaning that in practical terms, these guys are never going to see the light of day. They're going to die in jail. And thank God. Vlasakis, because of his plea deal and his cooperation, was convicted of 4 murders and was sentenced to 4 life sentences with a non-parole period of 26 years, rather than a full life without parole sentence, which I found to be a little interesting. Mark Hayden, his case was actually handled completely separately. He was convicted of assisting in the murders, helping dispose of the bodies, helping cover up the crimes, rather than the direct killing and executions of these people. He was sentenced to 25 years with an 18-year non-parole period.
Yeah, and so here's sort of a part of this case that might surprise you. Hayden was released from custody in May of 2024. He had served his non-parole period. And Vlasakis, now in his mid-40s, he is the subject of many parole type of hearings. And so it's been almost 20 years since he was sentenced, and everything is being presented. The parole board, they actually grant his parole, but then the judicial review pulls back and says, wait.
They're like,
right?
This guy? Are you kidding me?
And
We've already
so,
got one that's walking free.
Yeah.
You got to be joking.
I know. So then what happens is that even though his parole was granted, it is pulled back and sort of goes into this year-long parole or sort of parole type of review in 2025. And then in June of this year, this parole is still under review. So he still is sitting in prison with a granted parole.
And it's hard to believe that Hayden, somebody that is capable of disposing the bodies of people that he knew, is out there walking free. Despite the time served, he disposed of the body of his own wife. And yet, of course, he has served quite a few years behind bars. But come on, he's just walking free.
Right.
I don't know. That raises a question that none of us can answer comfortably. So let me ask you this. How do you weigh decades of cooperation and remorse against crimes of that magnitude? Because I can't. I mean, that's just an uphill battle that this guy can't win. There's no clean answer here. And the victims' families have actually, I mean, of course, they have had strong, painful reactions to this. Every single time the release comes up, they have to revisit it.
Right. Yeah. In every episode, one fact kind of sticks with us harder than some of the others. And so what's yours in Snowtown, in this particular episode on Snowtown?
For me, it's the fact that some of the victims actually were not reported missing for years. So just the sheer timeline of this whole thing. Not because nobody cared, not because nobody cared enough to check on their whereabouts or see where they were, but because the people that did care were actually being tricked for a very, very long time through the use of these heinous recordings that existed, but also because of the transactions on their bank accounts, the paper trail. The welfare checks were still being deposited. Money was going in and out. These are people that for whatever reason, were not being normally communicative, but based off of their bank records and this paper trail, like I said, they are still very much alive. So that to me is just the worst part of it all, because the fraud is not the side effect of the murders, right? The fraud was the reason behind these murders. And it's not that these people were, of course, any death is heinous in its own way, but these people faced an especially brutal ending to their lives. And, it's all for the money.
Yeah, that's the one that sort of gets to me too. Even with the recordings, it kind of reframes the whole case.
Yes.
It wasn't just, like we said, a warped moral crusade. It kind of dressed up as vigilante justice. It was really kind of that cold, sustained actions on, this system really wasn't designed to discover that sort of stuff.
And Snowtown itself is still living in the fallout of these murders. There was actually widespread public discussion of renaming the town to Rosetown to somehow, give a new life to this place where these horrible things happen. Although this town has barely touched what's gone on. It's barely even a part of the story, but it's a very significant part of the story. To this day, these 12 murders, almost none of which happened here, is the living reputation of this small spot.
So in the end, it really was this self-proclaimed, predator in a town called Snowtown. The bodies in the barrels, 12 families that are still dealing with the aftermath that is Snowtown and still living with it decades later. We say it in every episode, but it is worth repeating. These people did not deserve what they got. And as I've said before, everyone lies, but the evidence doesn't.
Absolutely. Please take a moment to comment to us below. We read every single one, and subscribe to our show. And you know what? Create an Observer Watch group, catch some friends that also love true crime, and let us know what you think about this episode and more.
Observers, thank you for joining us on this episode. It's kind of one of those gruesome stories, so we kind of thank you for sticking with us here. In the meantime, stay safe, my friends, and join us again next week as we investigate another unlawful act.